What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Mr. Smythe, out here in the streets with yet another AP Euro super awesome, super amazing review video. And tonight, shout out to everyone that's watching these, which is no one. And I know that because no one's commented on my ridiculous outfits or the production quality. But anyway, just throwing these things out into the interwebs, with getting nothing back. But that's fine. I'm not bitter about it. So this one we're going to talk about, folks, the age of absolutism and constitutionalism in Europe. So let's dive right in. This period in European history, like the several that we've talked about before, is influential because, again, everything in this course and really in history, in a sense, is like building a house, right? So every level builds on the levels before it. So the age of absolutism and constitutionalism is going to be the result of a lot of the things that have happened during the Renaissance, that period, the rise of new monarchs, which we mentioned, age of exploration a tiny bit, but the Reformation is going to be a big factor in this. What do all those things do when you put them together? Kind of like batter in a cake. They're going to create a situation where change in Europe has shifted in a direction where there's a massive centralization of power between political and religious authorities. And these changes open the door for various states in Europe to either become absolute monarchies or constitutional monarchies. So that's what we're talking about. All right. In general, let's start with absolutism. Okay. Absolutism is a situation where monarchs consolidated all of the power of the state under themselves in order to advance the needs of themselves or their state. And so this is a break and a shift from previous periods in European history where it was, again, we've mentioned this a couple times. It's a power sharing between the nobility, the monarchies, and the church, right? Church kind of sat at the top of that pendulum. The nobility was often in second place, and the monarchs were kind of like 2.5/ third place. So that's what's going to be happening in the states that go to the toward the absolute monarch position. This is also another an aspect of the absolute portion that we need to understand that's extremely important is what's called the divine right or the divine right of kings, which is this belief that becomes popularized throughout Europe that European monarchs are chosen by God to rule. That does a couple of things. One, it's going to set up a bloodline or reinforce the kind of bloodline hereditary lineup. I'm trying to think of a better word. Lineup? The word's escaping me. It's going to create a situation where if I'm the king, obviously my firstborn son is going to be king. Why? Because God chose me, and therefore my bloodline is, has divine intervention, has divine support, right? And so rulers will have to be born into that spot, right? And the other thing that this does is it adds a serious amount of authority to the ruler's reign because it gives them a certain sense of justification, right? If God chose me and God is all knowing and omnipotent, and then I must be the best person for the job. And so whatever I say basically is co-stamped or co-signed by God, right? And if you question me, or you go against me, you're questioning God or you're going against God. And that's a big no-no. So that is going to be a huge part of the absolute monarchs is the divine right of kings. Okay. Prior to this period, the power of the states was distributed between the monarch, the nobles, and the church. We talked about that. All right. So what are some of the causes for the rise of absolute monarchies or absolute states throughout Europe? So these are things that happened during those various periods that predate the age of absolutism. And some of them, again, throughout European history, we're talking about things that are happening kind of overlapping. So the first cause, there's two general causes. One, weakening influence of the Catholic Church. So we have a growing acceptance and tolerance of Protestantism throughout Europe. That's going to mitigate the power of the Catholic Church. And we have a lack of interest in religious warfare after the Peace of Westphalia. Peace of Westphalia is going to be something that we're going to talk about, and it's going to come up time and time again. We also have the rise of global trade. So as global trade rises due to the effects of the age of exploration, so did the merchant class. Okay, and the merchant class desires to have economic and political stability, right? Political stability equals economic stability and economic prosperity, right? People don't start businesses and businesses can't grow in periods of conflict because conflict creates instability and that makes people kind of hoard cash or they're hesitant to invest. Innovation is stagnant and things like this. So you have this merchant class who is accumulating wealth, accumulating power in society. And so they want to keep that ball rolling, dude. Right? Good times. We're on a gravy train with biscuit wheels and we want to keep it rolling. And so, in order to do that, given our understanding of the world politically at this time, the only way that we know that to do that is that there's one strong leader that can kind of keep us from these periods of just constant like chaos and this rotating wheel of who's in charge and all this type of thing. And power and under that umbrella, power is shifting away from landed nobility and into the hands of the merchant class. So because you're going to see this consistent decrease in the power of the noble or the nobility, the noble class or the nobility, and some of that has to do with the merchant class rising. Again, that's only going to increase the power of the monarchs because it's centralizing power, right? So if we're talking about absolute monarchs, the number one diva, best example is Louis the 14th. He is the preeminent example of an absolute monarch. He's the one that everybody loves to point to as the quintessential absolute monarch, and for a lot of reasons. Okay, first off, Louis is the king of France. He's a big time diva, right? He's got great hair. He's got great flow. He dresses extremely extravagantly. He lives an extravagant lifestyle. He is famous for saying, "I am the state." Right? That's really how he approached things. Right? Like I'm the one. I'm the state. I am France in a sense. He saw himself as the highest authority in the state of France. Right? And it's evident by that quote. So in the story of Louis the 14th, the first thing that we've talked about the first thing that we have to talk about that we have to talk about, sorry, is the oh God, I can't pronounce these French words. The Frondeur. I think I'm saying that wrong. Fronde. It's a rebellion of French nobles against Cardinal Mazarin. All right. He is the guy who's basically running France when Louis is first slotted into the position of the monarchy because Louis will come into the throne at a very young age. And so, what was commonplace kind of prior to this period and up to it is that you would get someone to kind of run the state in your place until you came of age. And so, the guy that's selected to do that is Cardinal Mazarin of France, and he is pretty well respected throughout France as an effective leader. So he's going to be the guy to do it. He's already been working, even before Louis comes to power. He's already working to consolidate power under the monarchy in France. So he's setting the table before Louis is ever even king. And he's doing that by diminishing the power of the nobility, right? Now, as a result of his actions, the French nobility is going to rise up in revolt. It throws France into a little bit of chaos, and Mazarin wins. And so that is a major shift in the dynamic of the political power structure in France because it's kind of this all in French nobility trying to kind of keep their foothold on things. They lose. And so, again, even before Louis steps onto the stage, the die has already been cast, so to speak. Another important guy to mention before we really get into Louis heavy is Jean-Baptiste Colbert. All right, he will be Louis's finance minister for a decent part of his reign, and he introduces a lot of economic reforms, which again are designed to consolidate power under the crown. Okay, so again, we have some guys here who are effective political leaders, and they're working for Louis to really consolidate all of the power in France under his rule. Again, really before and then even after he takes the throne. All right. Now, one of the things that Louis does is he establishes what's called the indentente system. Okay. Louis would send agents of the crown throughout France. These are his indententes, to act as administrators to ensure whatever law he has passed is being implemented or followed. And so that's really historically the role of the nobility. And that's historically part of the problem with the monarchs throughout Europe being able to effectively rule, right? Was because the administrators of the state from the Middle Ages on is really the nobility, right? If you're the king, you're one person. So how do you kind of control the net that you're casting? How do you ensure that the policies and the laws that you're implementing are being enforced or followed or whatever? Well, the nobility is supposed to do that, right? They're the administrators of the state out on the ground. But because historically the nobility kind of realized that that's where the real power of government often lies, they use that to their advantage. So what would happen historically is kings would push out laws or policies, and the nobility would just simply ignore them. And then what are you going to do? And again, historically, when the nobility even had, especially when they had the army, then you have no mechanism to even force them to do what you want them to do. So what this indentente system is it's a way to subvert the nobility or basically supplant them, replace them, right, with agents that are loyal to the crown that are going to go out and ensure that whatever Louis is pushing out is actually being pushed out, right? And so that certainly undermined the legitimacy or the effectiveness of local and regional nobility and ensured that in all parts of his kingdom, his rule was being obeyed. Now, Louis the 14th, there's two big Louis when it comes to the Palace of Versailles, the 14th and the 16th. We'll talk about the 16th later, but the 14th is the guy who builds the Palace at Versailles. And again, that's important because when we get to the French Revolution, we talk about Louis the 16th, Palace of Versailles is going to come up a lot, and that's going to be referenced, but it's important to understand that the 16th didn't build it, 14th did. All right, so he's the guy that's kind of responsible for building Versailles, which is the grandest royal palace in Europe at the time. I mean, it is ridiculous. The gate is solid gold, right? There's gold leaf on the roof of the exterior of the building. We looked it up. I think there's something like 60 uh, in 60 bathrooms with indoor, of some version of indoor plumbing at a time where, the vast majority of France has never seen that before. If you look up the specifics about the Palace of Versailles, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous even by today's standards. And we're talking about, all the way back in the 16th century. So he had now not only does he build the Palace of Versailles, this incredible, beautiful, opulent palace, but what he did that was very intelligent is he actually invites the nobility to move into the palace and live there with him, which is like a hard, sell to pass up because it's, the most incredible palace in the world. Who's going to say no to that, right? And he's throwing parties constantly. Now, this was a good move. So, hey, look how generous I am. But it's also extremely strategic because now that noble class that he's kind of dwindling their power, and he's also, they can still make problems for him, but it's going to be a lot harder for them to do that when they're living in his house, right? So it allows him to keep tabs on them. It also kind of allows him to influence and control them, right? So that was pretty effective. They were constantly, also because they're living in his house, they're constantly within his reach. And so it's this kind of like love because he lets, and admiration because he allows them to live in his palace and all of the prestige that comes with that, right? But it's also the fear of like, oh, he's right there, and I'm subject to his wrath, right? I can't run and hide in my own villa or castle or whatever. So, and he threw sick parties, like I mentioned. All right. Another thing that it's important to talk about when we talk about Louis the 14th is the Edict of Nantes, right? The Edict of Nantes was put into place by King Henry the Fourth, which gave an unprecedented level of religious freedom to the people of France. Okay, this led to an increase in the variety of religions with which the people of France worshipped. Louis is going to revoke this. Okay, and the reason why he's going to revoke this is because, just like we've mentioned previously with some other rulers, he understands that having one central religious or one central religion in your state and then controlling that religion allows you a vast amount of control over the people. So if everybody's Catholic and I basically control the Catholic Church in my state, it only increases the ability to which I can control the people within my state, right? So he's going to revoke the Edict of Nantes, um, and that's going to take power away from the Catholic Church in France. It's going to increase his power. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Huguenots are going to flee France. This robbed France. Downside, robbed France of a decent portion of their wealthy merchant class, but it gave Louis a country that was predominantly the same religion as he was and thus easier to control. So it's give and take. There is some negative to it. Louis also going to get entangled in a lot of wars. He's going to expand the power of the French military, which is another common characteristic of absolute monarchs, right? We're going to control the financial or an economic situation. We're going to put that under the crown. We're going to move religion under the crown. And then we're going to build our own kind of state, national army that's under the control of the monarch, not under the control of the nobility, right? A large, powerful army, fully under the control of the monarch. Unfortunately, though, when you do that, you got to use it, right? Because if you don't, use it or lose it. Um, he built this army by making Colbert build France's economy around mercantilist policies. All right. This decreased France's debt. It breathed new life into domestic industries. It expanded France's colonial holdings and created a favorable balance of trade for France, right? He put tariffs on foreign goods so that France was exporting more than they were importing, which is a basic economic principle, right? We're putting it into play here. It works. All right. So that's absolutism in France. That is a clear example of what's happening there, and it allows Louis to become an extremely powerful monarch. And the absolute monarchy in France is going to last basically up until Louis the 16th, right? From 14 to 16. Let's talk about absolutism in Russia. All right. The big name in Russia is Peter the Great. All right. He is a Russian czar. Now, Russia, unlike France, unlike really the rest of the rest of Europe, and as evident by the fact that we really haven't mentioned their name to this point, Russia really doesn't have a renaissance. They don't go through that period, and so they don't have this revival and this rebirth the rest of Europe does. And so by kind of this point where the rest of Europe is kind of coming out of the Renaissance, maybe we had a Reformation. Hey, we've had this period of rebirth. We've quote unquote modernized by the standard of the day. Russia is going to essentially be still in the Middle Ages, right? They're still living in this kind of feudal serf, very limited innovation, the land that time forgot, so to speak. And so what happens is when Peter becomes Tsar of Russia, he travels the rest of Europe. And what he sees is like, oh man, we're way behind everyone else. And so when he comes back to Russia after his trip throughout Europe, he's going to try and modernize France very rapidly and bring it up to kind of speed with a number of reforms and investments and infrastructure projects, try and make Russia like the rest of Europe, quote unquote, modernizing it. And he's pretty successful in doing that. Um, so Peter institutes a couple of reforms, like I mentioned. All right, political reforms. He requires nobles to serve in the army or a civil administration. So you got skin in the game. You got to get in. That also brings them under his control, right? You're not just out there on your own island with your own set of power. You're part of the military, which is under the rule of the crown, or you're going to be part of my civil administration, like basically pushing out my policies, right? And he, in doing that, he created something called the Table of Ranks. And this ensured that experts were at the top of every aspect of Russian government and society. So it's kind of like a meritocracy to an extent. All this limited the power of the nobility and thus increased the power of the crown in Russia. Again, not dissimilar to Louis and all these other absolute monarchs. Again, pushing control, centralizing control under the monarch. He also instituted a number of religious reforms. He reorganized the Russian Orthodox Church by eliminating the role of the former pope of the Russian Orthodox Church and replaced that role, the Pope of the Russian Orthodox Church, with a holy synod. Peter populated this role with officials and ministers who were loyal to him. So again, basically moving the church under the control of the state and then selecting the leadership of the church and making sure that those individuals are loyal to him, not to the church. Again, not dissimilar to what everybody else in this story is going to do. He also introduced a couple of cultural reforms. He tried to shape the Russian culture after modern European culture. He ordered the nobility to dress like Western Europeans, shave their beards, or pay a beard tax. Peter tripled the taxes, so most of the people in Russia hated him. So that wasn't super popular. It wasn't all gravy. Uh, he was he was able to rapidly modernize Russia and build it into a modern European power. And his work would eventually go on to be kind of carried forth or seen to fruition by his successor, Catherine the Great, who may or may not have killed him. So, as France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria are all moving towards absolutism, there are two places that are going in kind of an opposite direction towards constitutionalism. And the reason for that is there's differences in kind of the history of those two places. So the big name in constitutionalism during this period is England. Okay. England is going to go towards a constitutionalism style government, which is where government is limited by the rule of law. The monarch has to share power with the elected government body. Okay. The main European states that we're going to see do this, we mentioned England already. And the other one is the Dutch and the Netherlands. All right. So let's talk about how this happens in England. So a big part of the constitutional monarchy developing in England is the English Civil War, which runs from 1642 to 1651. This is a conflict between the king, parliament, and other elites over their respective rules in the power structure of England. All right. So what are the causes of the English Civil War? Uh, well, as the rest of Europe is getting into this whole absolute things, we have at this period before the English Civil War, we have English monarchs who kind of see that going on in France and Russia, and they're like, hey, that's a pretty good gig. I'd love to have that here. And so this whole idea of the divine right of kings and absolute monarchs is starting to bleed into England. And we have some English monarchs that are trying to like push things in that direction. The problem for them is, and what's different about England from the rest of Europe where this stuff kind of takes off, is there's already something in place as a result of English history that can block this. And the people are already accustomed to the monarchy in England having a limit on its power. And that is a result of something that comes from the 12th century. That's the English Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta was created. I'm sorry, the Magna Carta created English Parliament and gave power over the money, the expenditures of England, to Parliament, and that really prevented the English king from wielding absolute power. So the problem here is they already have the Magna Carta. The people of England are accustomed to there being restrictions on their monarch's power because they kind of already went through this and had this turmoil and had this conversation a long time ago. And so when the English kings are trying to push towards absolutism, the people are like, hold on, that's not how we do business here. And we're certainly not going to abandon the way that the rights that we do have, that we have had, right, that we fought for, so that you can be an absolute monarch. Like that's the whole point of Parliament, the Magna Carta, and all this. So this becomes a problem with the first English king who's trying to push things in this direction, James the First. James the First is the successor to Elizabeth the First, who died without an heir. James believed that a monarch was God's representative on earth. And as a result, there were no limits to his power. And to try and put a limit on his power was an affront to God, right? So there's the conflict, right? It's going to start with James and ultimately transfer into his son, Charles the First. Charles the First is going to replace James as king, and he grew up under his father, James, with also this kind of divine right of kings belief. And so Charles is actually going to be even more of a believer in the fact that there should be an absolute monarch in England, and that he's kind of not only that it should be that way, but he's entitled to it, right? And so he's going to even push it further than his father. And one of the big things with Charles is he's going to believe that he has the right, because he has this kind of divine right, to take property, any property that he sees fit, away from anyone who has it. And who has most of the property in England at this time? The nobility, who is also at this time most of Parliament. And so that's going to piss off Parliament, right? And that's wherein lies the conflict. So let's talk about the economy in England, where this is going to be an issue. Both James and Charles I were forced to spend tons of money during the 30 Years' War and the Irish Rebellion. So this leaves England significantly in debt. The nobility wanted to cut spending because they're in debt, and Charles, successor of James, Charles I in particular, doesn't agree. And so Charles comes up with this great idea, which is pretty hilarious and extremely petty, which I like, where he's like, okay, if Parliament controls the spending in England, and they don't want to approve any of my spending because we're in debt. One of the powers that the king did have over Parliament is he's supposed to call them into session. So the way that it was supposed to work is like, okay, I'm the king of England. I want to spend some money on a war. I want to spend some money on whatever I want to do. I call Parliament into session. They come in, they meet. Hey guys, I want to go to war. I need this much money. And then they have their little meeting and they vote and then they tell me yes or no. Either I can have the money or not. Can't really stop me from going to war, but they can just not pay for it. Kind of like President and Congress in the United States today. So where the petty genius of Charles is, he realizes like, oh, I just won't call them into session. And so he tries to essentially spend money and do the things he wants to do simply by not calling them into session, which is kind of this awesome loophole because if he doesn't call them into session, they can't review things and then they can't tell him no. So technically, he's not disobeying or going against Parliament because they never really met to decide that he can't do these things. So this is like his little petty loophole that's kind of genius and kind of works. And so Charles will just not call Parliament into session for an extended period of time, which again allows him some leeway. So he's spending money, kind of making the situation worse, but also it's just going to piss them off more. So when he eventually does call them into session, he's got no shot, right? They're already furious at him. So in 1640, Charles is forced to call Parliament into session because he needs to raise taxes. He needs to get money to he has a rebellion in Scotland. He's got to suppress it. He's kind of already blown through whatever, cushion money he had that he's already spent without their approval. He hasn't cut spending. So he calls them in. He's like, listen, I got to put this rebellion down in Scotland. And so when he calls Parliament in this time, this is what's referred to as the Long Parliament. And it's called the Long Parliament because the catch to the king having to call Parliament is the king is the guy in England at this time, per the rules, that like starts the session of Parliament, and then Parliament actually has the power to conclude it. So what Parliament does once he calls them in is like they kind of figured out his game is you just won't call us. So we're not really agreeing on things. We're afraid that if we wrap this session up, that you won't call us back. So they just refuse to end the session. Hence the Long Parliament, because they never close the session. It just kind of goes on for an extended period of time. Parliament will pass the Triennial Act, which forces the king to call Parliament into session at least once every year. At least once every 3 years, thus creating more limits on the power of the king. So genius Parliament. Okay, we'll just pass a law that says that you have to call us in. You can't just bypass us. So they closed that loophole. Charles isn't going to like that. So outside of the economy and the money situation, there's also this religious issue. Now, if you remember back, we have Henry VIII, who starts the Church of England during the Protestant movement. The Anglican Church, or the Church of England, those two terms are interchangeable, was still pretty much a copy of the Catholic Church by the time that James and Charles I come to power, right? So if you remember, just a brief synopsis, Henry VIII is the king. He's got that wife. She can't give him an heir. It's probably his fault, whatever. And he decides he wants to divorce her, and he's going to marry his mistress. He goes to the Pope for an annulment. The Pope won't go for it because the Pope is real close with the royal family in Spain, and his wife at the time is Spanish. So King Henry VIII, in a moment of like the greatest petty I'll show you move ever, just goes like, all right, I'll just do my own religion. I'll make myself the head of it. And, because he didn't really think this one out, when he's like, all right, we're now, we're separating from the Catholic Church. We're doing our own church. And everyone's like, well, what is it? And he's like, oh, it's the same thing, just where I can get divorced. Awesome. I mean, if you're king and you're not doing that, like, what's the point, right? Um, so fast forward, we're now at James and Charles the First, and people are kind of like looking around, like, "Hey, man, we have our own religion, and it's basically the same thing. Like, what's the point, right?" And this is where we get into conflict with the Puritan movement, which is started by this point, and they want to purify the Church of England, and basically remove a bunch of aspects of Catholicism out of the church that they feel like are unnecessary, unwarranted, whatever. And so there's an issue there. Both monarchs are refused to give in to the Puritans. Charles even marries a Catholic, which is a huge problem for the Puritans. And so there's that religious turmoil. After 3 years of bloody civil war, Parliament's new model army. All right, so let me back up. That's what gets us kind of into the Civil War, right? So we have these economic issues, we have the political breakdown. The king's not doing what he's supposed to do. He's not working with Parliament. Now we have this religious influence, right? The king's not really embracing the Anglican Church. He's married a Catholic, and so there's all this turmoil and conflict, and king's trying to take our powers, all that. And so that's what gets us into the English Civil War. And so after 3 years of this bloody civil war, the Parliament's forces, which is called the New Model Army, is victorious over the King's army. All right, and that's now, despite this major victory, Charles, who's like so petty, refuses to concede. So he loses this huge battle. By all stretches, like, everyone's like, "Dude, you lost. It's over." And he's like, "Nah, it's not. I'm not. I don't. I'm still the king." Right? And now it's at this point in the story where another main character comes in, and his name is Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is a Puritan who was a leader in both Parliament and then later this new model army. Okay. So he's like the general of Parliament's army against the king's forces, and he's very influential in delivering that big victory over the king. His intention in doing all of this is to create a Commonwealth of England, basically to do what's in line with England, do what's best for England, and embrace the constitutional part of the constitutional monarchy. Right? England's run by the people. So after this civil war, Cromwell and his forces kind of come out on top, and he establishes Parliament as the government of England. And because he's the leader of the new model army, he's kind of elected to be the leader of this new kind of constitutional government. And so he's going to kick out any members of Parliament who were or are loyal to the king. Now, that Cromwell Parliament, which removes all of the members of Parliament who are on the king's side, that is called the Rump Parliament. Okay. And the Rump Parliament then tries to put Charles I on trial for treason, and doesn't try, they do. They find him guilty because, remember, he's not conceding. So they put him on trial for treason. They basically point out that he kind of was doing treason, right? He is violating all of the rules and everything in England, and he is executed. And so this is a major moment in not just European history, but in English history, because we're actually executing a king. And the execution of monarchs throughout European history is pretty rare when you look at the numbers. So it's a very significant moment, right? Now, Charles I is dead. So who's in charge? Well, it's going to be Cromwell and his Rump Parliament, right? And here's the crazy part about this. Cromwell very quickly becomes basically what Charles I and James the First was. He basically becomes an absolute monarch, right? Even though everyone's looking at him like, dude, we signed off on this because you were the dude. Like, I want to make England, for the people and all this. I mean, you're literally the guy. You're the guy who did it, and then you just turn around and become the very thing that made you famous fighting against. So when he comes into power with his parliament, his Rump Parliament, this is called the Protectorate, right? And Cromwell is named Lord Protectorate, right, of England. He didn't turn over, so when he's given this power, he doesn't really turn it over to the people like everyone thought he would, like he was talking like he would. Instead, he consolidates more power in England under himself and his Rump Parliament. Very Machiavellian, right? There's a across time, there's a continuity example, right? Cromwell, Machiavelli, right? Um, Cromwell would die in 1658, and like a lot of these types of situations in history, when you have kind of the guy, right, and it's not really a strong, thought out, well developed government. It's kind of centered around one, special personality. When that person dies, it kind of falls apart, right? Because it was that person that was really holding it together, kind of making up the rules as they went. And so when he dies in 1658, the protectorate falls apart pretty quickly. The people didn't like it anyway because they thought they were getting basically a government for and by the people. It wasn't that. They basically had what they had when they had a king. That brings us to what's called the Restoration period in 1660. This is where Parliament restored the monarchy by installing Charles II to the English throne. So this is a descendant of Charles I. Okay, Cromwell's dead. The protectorate sucked anyway. It falls apart. What are we going to do? We're all looking around. All right, let's just go back to having a king. We have our parliament. Nobody's really done the full democracy thing so much yet, so that's not even on our minds. Like everyone's under this illusion throughout Europe that you like have to have a monarch, even if you're going to do some form of democracy, because that's what everyone's always had. And there's this really strong belief that like you have to have a monarch, right? If you don't, democracy won't work, nothing will work, right? You need that kind of strong central leader. And even in America, when we write the Constitution and for the people and all this, what do we put in? We put a president in. You have to have the executive, right? A little stronger in Europe than it is in America. So in 1660, we go through this restoration period. We put Charles II on the throne. We go back to having a constitutional monarchy because we kind of did anyway under Cromwell. The problem is Charles II sucks. He's a terrible king. And he didn't want to do what Parliament wanted, kind of like, his lineage. And so here we go again in England. We have another guy in charge. We put this guy in charge, just like we put the last one, and he's not doing what the people want. He's not listening to Parliament. It's the same old song, and we're really getting tired of it. There's also a lot of people throughout England who believe that he's kind of conspiring with France. He's a little too close to France. Those are our big enemies, so we're not down with that. That's a big no-no. And so after Charles II, we get James II, right? And he comes to take the throne. And James II is going to make a lot of mistakes, like everybody else did. He's going to appoint a lot of Catholics to important positions in the English military and the English in universities throughout England, and that's not going to be very popular with the people. And so that brings us to the final kind of phase of this whole story, which is called the Glorious Revolution. And we'll get to why it's called the Glorious Revolution in a second. So Parliament doesn't like James II. They didn't like James. They didn't like Charles II. And they didn't really like Oliver Cromwell. And once again, here we are. James II is another dude that we kind of let be in charge. He's not listening to Parliament. He's pushing Catholics. We're supposed to be the Anglican Church or the Church of England. Like, why don't these dudes get it? We just want someone. We want a king, but we want a king that's like for the people. Basically, we want a figurehead to do what they're told. And so Parliament decides that they're going to offer the throne to his daughter, Mary, who we would know as Bloody Mary. And she just happens to be married to a guy by the name of William, or William of Orange. And so they're going to offer the throne. By the way, while her dad, James II, is still king, they're going to go to William and Mary, and they're going to say, listen, William, by the way, has no shot at being king on his own. But they're like, listen, you guys can be the king and queen of England as long as you agree to like do what Parliament says. And William and Mary at this, it's not like they have a better alternative, right? It's either be the king and queen of England and have some power, or don't be either of those two things and have no power. So they're going to sign off on it. They're going to go for it. And that's where we get this kind of Glorious Revolution title, because when they agree to it, James II just rolls out. He doesn't stay and fight. It's not a big thing. I mean, they're kind of ready for it. They kind of expected that there was going to be another civil war, but James just kind of leaves. Everybody at all levels of England is on board with this, and so we get William and Mary, and they kind of support Parliament, and we get this change that we wanted in England, and we get it without any violence, without any bloodshed, and that's why we call it the Glorious Revolution, right? And that ends the idea of the divine right of kings in England. From that point forward, It's a constitutional monarchy. England is essentially a government to an extent of the people. They're going to have a king, but it's a government of the people. Parliament is where the power will reside in England from this point forward to varying degrees. Now, the other concession that came along with the ability to take the throne for William and Mary is they had to agree to and sign the English Bill of Rights. And this includes, so this is like Magna Carta times 10, right? This is where we're going to get, we're putting this down on paper now. So we're not having another Charles III, and we're not doing all this again, right? We're going to have the English Bill of Rights now, and it's going to avoid all this stuff for all time. And it includes a number of provisions for Parliament where the monarch is not allowed to levy taxes. It stipulated that Parliament made a law could not be annulled by the monarch, and it locked in constitutionalism. So they sign off on that because they get the throne in return. Boom, bam, bing, constitutionalism in England. Let's talk about the next place that constitutionalism is big. That's with the Dutch in the Netherlands. And this is where we get what's called the Dutch Golden Age. Antwerp, it's a Dutch trading city, placed perfectly along the coast of the Atlantic. And as a result, it becomes a prosperous state in Europe during this period. So the Dutch are killing it. They're on the drip hard. They're making tons of money, and it has a lot to do with their geography. For almost a century, the Dutch were controlled by the Habsburg Empire of Spain. Philip II is the ruler about this time of the story. And as the Dutch get more and more wealthy, Philip II of Spain wants to get a better hold over the Dutch because the Dutch are making a lot of money. Technically, it's controlled by Spain. So Philip's like, I want a bigger piece of the pie. He passes a number of policies that would clamp down on the Netherlands and bring more of their wealth into Spain. He also grew more and more frustrated by the rise of Protestantism in the Netherlands, because remember, Spain is big into Catholicism, which led to the increased disobedience towards his rule. So he's equating those two things. Like they're getting more Protestants, they're not listening to me. Right, this is a problem. And when the Dutch Protestants began to protest Philip II, he sent an army in to suppress the revolt and ended up killing thousands of these Dutch protesters. And this is where, it's a rehash. We heard this guy's name before. Told you we would get to it. This is where we get William of Orange. William rose up as a result of the Spanish aggression and led the Dutch to ridding the Netherlands of Spanish influence, thus establishing the Dutch Republic. So that's where William, future King of England, that's where he comes from. He gets his name from being big in the Netherlands and pushing the Spanish out of the Netherlands. And he goes on to marry Bloody Mary and thus becomes King of England. So let's talk about the Dutch Republic. The Peace of Westphalia, which ends the 30 Years' War, which is really 80 Years' War between the Dutch and the Spanish. And as a result, the Dutch Republic emerged as the wealthiest European commercial empire. Right? They would lead Europe in the Atlantic trade, in the Indian Ocean trade, and for a while, really basically all trade in Europe. This is, the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch Republic would build its new independent government around the idea of an oligarchy rather than a monarchy. So their oligarchy was called the States General. It was a small group of rich land or business owners, and mainly they passed policies to benefit themselves rather than the people of the Netherlands. Right? Same situation that's going on throughout the rest of Europe. It's amazing how all these different forms of government basically are doing the same thing, right? Whether it's one guy or multiple guys, it's whatever. So that's what happens in the Netherlands, and that's the Dutch Golden Age. So let's stop there for tonight. After the next video I do tomorrow, not after that, but tomorrow I'll do another video on the balance of power, or the establishment, the rise of this concept of the balance of power throughout Europe at this time, kind of during the age of absolutism and constitutionalism in the late 1600s through the 1700s. So we'll talk about that. That'll kind of bring us through the agricultural revolution and kind of dip our toe just a tad into kind of some of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And then we'll talk about the Age of Reason, kind of the Enlightenment, stuff like that. And then we'll get into the French Revolution, and so on and so forth we go. All right, so that's it for this video, absolutism and constitutionalism. And like I said, tomorrow night we'll do balance of power and maybe the agricultural revolution combine them into two. All right, see you guys tomorrow night.